It's the Marquis of Queensberry's proudest moment on NES Works episode 62. A few episodes ago, we looked at a timeless basketball game in the form of Konami's Double Dribble. Now we have an equally durable take on boxing with Nintendo's very own Mike Tyson's Punch-Out! That's pretty rough for Data East, whose arcade boxing conversion Ring King appeared alongside Double Dribble. It was a reasonably competent take on boxing, but it's eclipsed in every sense by Punch-Out! It's almost unfair to compare the two games, honestly. Ring King is a fairly straightforward interpretation of pugilism using an overhead format that was fairly standard for ring-based combat sports like boxing and wrestling, at least at the time. Punch-Out! Works more like a rhythm game, one that just happens to play out in a ring between two men wearing trunks and gloves while executing boxing maneuvers. It's bold, it's colorful, and it's loaded with personality, and it involves opponents whose most powerful moves bear no resemblance to anything seen in actual boxing matches. Shipping in the US in late 1987 for NES, Mike Tyson's Punch-Out! Is broadly adapted from a 1984 arcade game that was simply called Punch-Out! Despite arriving 3 years after the coin-op release, the NES still couldn't hope to match the visual splendor of the arcade game. The original Punch-Out! Boasted some of the most impressive graphics that had ever been seen in arcades to that point, with massive animated characters and a cool over-the-shoulder viewpoint in which the player's boxer appeared as an animated grid that allowed the rival boxer's body to show through. This was a huge boon to the game since it allowed opponents to behave with visible tells, rewarding players for attentiveness without compromising the visuals or the action. The NES simply didn't have the graphical horsepower to display visuals on Punch-Out's scale. Nintendo's home development team had to make the best of things. The home conversion team was led by Genyo Takeda. His work here would lead him to become Nintendo's go-to guy for creating games that appealed to Western tastes, such as STARTROPICS. Punch-Out! Was a tiny blip on Famicom, a barely remembered Japanese release that came and went, but it was huge in America. No doubt the difference in popularity between here and there has a lot to do with regional tastes, as boxing is simply a bigger deal in the US than in Japan. But it certainly didn't hurt the game's performance in the US that Nintendo tied it to the ascent of the biggest boxing star of the decade, Mike Tyson. Tyson had stunned the world, not to mention his rivals, by becoming the youngest heavyweight boxing champion ever, soon after his meteoric 1985 debut. And he retired as an almost undisputed champ. Tyson was known not only for his skill in the ring, but also for his aggressive, intimidating style. Landing the name of boxing's so-called Kid Dynamite for the game would have been an impressive coup on its own, but Mike Tyson's Punch-Out! Went way beyond mere lip service. Tyson appears here as essentially the final boss, the near impossible foe you face as your reward for working your way up the ranks of the Video Boxing Association and taking down the other, lesser pugilists along the way. Punch-Out! Gives Tyson the same visual treatment with which all the other game's opponents are presented. He's a huge, cartoonish enemy, a brilliant effigy of the real athlete, sized to be profoundly intimidating, and with the speed and moves to match. The NES admittedly wasn't able to punch in at the same class as the arcade game's graphics, not least of all because the arcade machine featured 2 monitors, allowing the game's heads-up display of health meters and timers to appear separately from the character visuals. That didn't stop Nintendo from giving it their best shot, though. Mike Tyson's Punch-Out! Is a unique game on the NES. It's the only release ever to make use of the MMC2 mapper chip. We've touched on mapper chips before. Ghosts and Goblins was the first NES release to make use of one, while Metroid and Kid Icarus used a more advanced model called the MMC1 to give their NES cartridges most of the same advanced capabilities as the disk system versions of those games that appeared in Japan. Mike Tyson's Punch-Out! Matched the disk system's capabilities by utilizing the MMC2 chip. It was a device whose capabilities made possible all the huge, highly animated opponent sprites by allowing the game to instantaneously swap between graphical sets. So while Punch-Out! On NES couldn't look quite as impressive as it did in the arcades, it still featured visuals far more stunning than anything that had come before it on the console. Only the slam-dunk cutscenes in Double Dribble compare, and those were fixed, non-interactive visual inserts. On the other hand, Punch-Out! Features impressive graphics and is fully real-time. In fact, it's extremely real-time, maybe more so than any NES game before it. Boxing matches here are highly sensitive to timing. Your opponent's maneuvers can be predicted and countered based on their visual tells, but the reaction time you're given often comes down to a split second. Punch-Out! Requires reflexes and precision like nothing we've seen since Wild Gunman. This has turned Punch-Out into a favorite subject for testing display lag on new screens and systems. The precise timing around which its matches revolve mean that the addition of a few frames of visual lag render the whole thing nearly unplayable. Slogging through Punch-Out on a mediocre emulator or an HD TV with a subpar upscaler can be an utterly miserable experience. On a proper setup though, something like real hardware and a CRT, or a high-quality HD emulation solution like the NES Classic Edition or Analog Super NT, Mike Tyson's Punch-Out is a tough and unforgiving game, but a fair one. I admit that I'm awful at it, as you can see from the footage I've captured, but for players without my old man reflexes, it's a real test of skill and learning. A big part of what makes Mike Tyson's Punch-Out such a joy to play is its personality. Tyson isn't the only boxer rendered as a larger-than-life caricature. Every fighter here is. Each opponent you face is a sort of horrifying ethnic or national stereotype, although the most egregious case from the arcade, booze-swilling Russian, vodka drunkinsky, was toned down to the goofy soda popinsky thanks to Nintendo of America's censorship standards. So Mike Tyson's Punch-Out may not exactly be the most enlightened game, but the stereotypes are at least good-spirited and paint everyone from all nations with an equally tacky brush. You have your weakling bantamweight loser from France, Glass Joe, a massive Samoan named King Hippo, a camera-obsessed Japanese boxer named Piston Honda, and a mystical Indian warrior named Great Tiger. Meanwhile, your hero is a kid named Little Mac, so named because he's incredibly tiny, and probably also because a favorite stereotypical association with America in Japanese pop media is hamburgers. The NES lacked the horsepower to render the player's challenger as an arcade-style grid overlay. So instead, this Little Mac is hilariously tiny compared to his opponents. Weirdly though, this visual disconnect works. Instead of looking awkward like when normal Mario rescues the double-height princess, it simply keeps the player character compact and out of the way, so your opponent's ticks and tells show through clearly. Little Mac's animations actually lean into the size disparity, with Mac often straining and reaching to perform uppercuts. This really shouldn't work, especially when opponents launch a straight jab and foreshortening causes their boxing glove to appear nearly as large as Mac's entire body, but somehow it does. Animation factors heavily into the rival boxers as well. I've mentioned their tells a few times already, but it's difficult to overstate how critical subtle animations are to the gameplay here. Each boxer can display several different poses and reactions, and each of these telegraphs their behavior. A lot of enemy behavior is scripted and can eventually be memorized, as demonstrated in some of Awesome Games Done Quickly's more amazing Punch-Out exhibitions. But until you have burned every second of the game into your gray matter, you can go a long way by simply learning how to read your foes. Each opponent you face has one or two show-off maneuvers that allow them to deliver extra powerful attacks or strike in rapid succession. For example, Spanish boxer Don Flamenco will step back and taunt the player before laying into them. While Great Tiger can launch a fusillade of tiger punches, it's essential to not only learn which attack an opponent is about to launch, but also how these techniques can be countered. Certain blows will deliver extra damage, or even a one-hit knockdown to Little Mac if they connect, and many have to be either dodged or blocked. However, you can also counter many blows to deliver extra damage to an opponent's stamina, or potentially even stun them. Simply punching an opponent won't get you very far beyond your first couple of rounds with Glass Joe and Von Kaiser. You need to make use of counters, and stuns, and star attacks. Star attacks are special, extra powerful punches that Little Mac can earn by performing specific feats. You'll earn a star attack for landing a certain number of basic body blows, but they also will be dispensed when you perform specific counters or blocks against a foe. You can spend a star to attempt a super attack at any time, but generally an opponent will simply dodge them. For maximum effect, you'll want to launch a star punch when a foe is vulnerable, which sometimes means hitting them while they're stunned, but may also mean interrupting their super attack, or delivering one as a follow-up to a dodged strike. Punch-Out is a pretty simple game at heart, but it puts its sandbox of features to use in creative ways to force players to learn the nuances of each match. You even face several fighters in rematches, but there they bring new skills and timing to those battles, forcing those encounters to be learned anew. All in all, it is a brilliant take on boxing, and it cleverly works around the innate limitations of the NES to bring home a version of the game that in many ways surpasses the arcade original. By harnessing new technology for the sake of smart character design and animation, Punch-Out earns a place for itself in the annals of history, regardless of its final boss. See, Punch-Out actually shipped in two different versions on NES. There's Mike Tyson's Punch-Out, of course, but the game was also reissued a few years later as Punch-Out featuring Mr. Dream, an update that was completely identical to the Mike Tyson version aside from the fact that it lacked Tyson himself. Nintendo's licensing agreement with Tyson had lapsed, but Punch-Out remained a perennial seller, so the company simply swapped out Tyson's head sprite for a made-up character and lightened his skin tone color palette to become Mr. Dream. The licensing lapse ultimately worked to Nintendo's benefit, as Tyson had become something less than an ideal role model by 1990. By that point, Tyson had lost his title belt to Buster Douglas, his personal life had become tabloid fodder, and he had begun to struggle in the ring. A year later, he would be arrested for and convicted of sexual assault. While Tyson would eventually return to a successful boxing career after time in prison, his reputation never really recovered. There's a sad irony to all of this, considering the original version of the game included a Tyson-pinned letter extolling the importance of honesty and clean play. In any case, he turned out to be not the ideal representative for the squeaky clean Nintendo of the 90s, and his replacement by a made-up champion meant that Nintendo could reissue the modified version of the game for years to come on Virtual Console and other services. Punch-Out has remained a nostalgic favorite among Nintendo fans, though the series has never performed as well as it did on NES. The Super NES sequel, Super Punch-Out, went largely unnoticed by most fans. More than 20 years later, Next Level Games remade the NES version of Punch-Out for Wii, with 3D graphics and a few new opponents, including Donkey Kong, a solid million-selling modernization of the classic. And Little Mac lives on as a brawler in the Smash Bros. Series. In short, Punch-Out may have kited off Mike Tyson's fame to land its success on NES, but its excellent design and colorful personality have ultimately kept it alive in the hearts of fans. Quite a few boxing games have attempted to copy the Punch-Out style over the years to varying degrees of success, including Nintendo's own TELEROBOXER for Virtual Boy, but only Midway's Ready to Rumble boxing series has really come close to equaling its quality and appeal. 1987 was a hell of a year for NES, and Mike Tyson's Punch-Out kept the streak going. Bursting with technical innovation and design inspiration, it further cemented the console as an essential for any serious fan of gaming. Next time, NES Works never says die.